So we know we set the scene. We started with a note-making method that we used during Anne Laura's session moments ago on combinational creativity. We're going to use that same method where we say, that's interesting. That reminds me, that's similar to, that's different from, and that's important because we're taking those prompts with the conversations that we enter. And so that note-making method, I want you to consider how you can do that during the conversation I'm about to have with the one and only Bob Doto. And Bob is returning. He was, I think, he's the only return, maybe Bianca, only return member from the first Linking Your Thinking conference into the second one. So we can continue the conversation around all things Zettelkasten, Linking Your Thinking frameworks, linked notes, index cards. What's it all about? Where are the differences? Where are the similarities? This is excellent opportunity for us to practice note making in action. So last thing to know is that Bob has done a lot of interesting things. For 20 years, Bob has taught in environments as diverse as punk warehouses, the public education system, residential living rooms, online Zoom rooms, and at the college level. He's the former managing editor at Parabola Magazine, is a prolific essayist, and has been blogging under a variety of pseudonyms since 2001. I'll fast forward to say right now, his weekly newsletter, The High Pony, covers PKM, creativity, and productivity from a spiritual and socio-economic perspective. He also surfs off the coast of New York, practices Chinese bodywork, and has a daily Ashtanga Yoga practice. So nice to have you, Bob. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me. Love getting a chance to speak with you and to your community about all things notes related.
That's right. Yep. Very excited as well. So how are you doing overall? I mean, how's the last few weeks treating you?
Oh, great. You know, the here on the East Coast and in New York, the summer, we have 4 seasons over here. I don't know if you're familiar with the 4 seasons out in LA, but we have them. And usually by the end of one of them, we're kind of ready for the next one. So this is the end of summer, which I love summer, but you know, I'm ready for the leaf peeping season for the fall.
September typically is the best season up in those northern states. Maybe the end of September. It's still probably a little hot over there. Well, hey, that's great. And I want to let everyone know, I think the chat is working. Although I enjoyed how we could use the Q&A instead, and I still encourage you to go to the Q&A where you can ask questions and then thread your actual responses underneath each question. It's a way that we didn't realize this, but it was a happy little accident where life gave us lemons, we made lemonade. Life gave us a lime, we made a mojito. I still don't know what to do with all the grapefruit. I still don't know what to do with grapefruit, but we'll do something with it.
Honey and
so
salt.
Yeah. What was that?
Honey and salt. That's how I take grapefruits.
Okay. I like the honey. With that in mind, I'm going to ask a million questions and then we're going to hop into it, Bob.
Okay.
Zettelkasten, it started a while ago, decades ago, and it kind of came back onto the scene recently as we could now digitally easily link ideas, notes together, and has kind of grown in a lot of different directions. Some are a little bit truer to the original form, and some are a little bit of their own thing, but certainly share characteristics of the original form. So here are a few questions for everyone listening. What is Zettelkasten? What is it really? Like if you're practicing it, what does it look like? For those of you who know linking your thinking, what's the difference between the two? Is it exactly the same? What are the intentions behind each? Are there different intentions between Zettelkasten and linking your thinking? What are the domains of knowledge management? What are you trying to accomplish with knowledge, with writing, with ideas? And is the Zettelkasten for you? Are the light frameworks for you? Or is there something else out there that might be more for you? These are things that we'll explore together. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob, and maybe just ask if we can start exploring what is Zettelkasten. And I'll just preface this by saying that I don't trust anyone more than Bob when it comes to understanding Zettelkasten and being able to explain it to the rest of us in a way that we can also understand. So
Yeah.
what do you think?
Few things right out of the gate, with Zettelkasten. When we're talking about Zettelkasten, we're typically talking about Niklas Luhmann's take on the Zettelkasten, right? So Zettelkasten, German word, slip box, card filing system. So very broad strokes, that's it, right? And it's just how people use this very simple technology of slips of paper in a box, and then now sort of progressed out into digital ways of doing that as well. But when we talk about Zettelkasten, typically we're talking about Niklas Luhmann's take on the Zettelkasten and how he worked with Zettelkasten specific to his needs and the way he understood how his brain worked, or, he built his system around what he needed out of necessity. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Zettelkasten. But that Zettelkasten, as I teach it, is a Zettelkasten is a container comprised of multiple compartments. And in those compartments are specific kinds of notes. Those notes have different purposes. And one of the main purposes, or the main compartments, are the notes that we link dynamically across ideas and across trains of thought and things of that nature. So yeah, it's a dynamic system primarily used for ideating or thinking and turning that thinking into some sort of output, typically writing. Historically, that's kind of been the mode of expression people have used it for, but it could be used for any number of things. But it really works with that kind of ideation and creation, that little tension and positive relationship between the two.
Okay. Ideation. So when it comes to Zettelkasten, ideation isn't too far removed. They kind of seem to go hand in hand.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the whole, again, speaking in Luhmann's system, the whole approach is that you're linking ideas that are captured in these notes, right? Whether they're digital or analog, hard copy or not. You're capturing ideas, and then you're engaging with those ideas in a way that you can find links between other ideas you've captured. So for some people, that means writing notes in direct response to other notes already in the Zettelkasten, which was one of Luhmann's kind of very common practices. Or whether you take a note and you kind of sift through to see how it might link. And if it doesn't link, then you start a new thread, and that's the beginning of a new idea thread. But yeah, at that level, you're really just thinking, right? You're exploring, expanding, unpacking ideas. But the real leveraging of it happens for many people with turning those ideas into some sort of output.
So I don't know about you, but that's important, all this talk of ideas, to me, because I feel like as a society, the majority of people focused on productivity are focused on projects and tasks and to-dos. And I'm of the very strong opinion that actually suffocates a lot of the ideas that we have. Ideas are fragile. They need time to kind of figure out what they are, or what we want to do with them, or where they're going to be developed. Sometimes it's nice to have a forcing function to speed up that process. But I think there's something around project management and task management that is different than idea management and maybe writing management. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on kind of these forms of knowledge management: projects, tasks, ideas, outputs, writing?
I mean, I've definitely spoken about it. I've written very little bit about it, but I certainly have spoken about it. This idea where productivity like TM, like productivity, the scene has kind of infiltrated in a way, or like at least made itself strongly known and influential within the ideas and the world of ideas, right? Where previously ideas, as long as they weren't attached to kind of demanded academic output, could have time to fester or just germinate, the things that ideas need to do. And you see that with Zettelkasten for sure, because there's usually, certainly on all those 101, what's a Zettelkasten articles on Medium, one of the first things people will mention is Niklas Luhmann, and the fact that Niklas Luhmann wrote 4 million articles and 7,000 books in, 2 weeks. It's like this, he was highly productive. And that's fine. That's a great story. That's interesting, and it's unique in some ways. Though historically, back in the day, people wrote lots of books, as well. It's just in more modern times, it's more rare. But I think people pick up on that aspect and extend that out to the Zettelkasten, that the Zettelkasten is a productivity machine. And the thing is that it certainly can be. The way it works, the way the notes connect, the way you sift through notes, the way you find old notes, it really does kind of excite the mind, excite the spirit. It excites you into creating. At least it has for me, and I know for other people as well. So in that sense, it really begs you. A friend of mine, this is a totally random example, but a friend and I were talking about motorcycles the other day, a difference between sort of sport bikes, the kind of like fast, what are called crotch rockets, really fast bikes, and kind of cruiser motorcycles. And the fast sport bikes, they don't like to be in low gear. They want to go fast. It's like you get on a sport bike and it wants to just go. It really does better when it's fast. And the Zettelkasten is kind of like that in a way, or at least it can be. It like wants to be worked with. You get all these ideas and you see them connecting, and then you want to do something with it. So it sort of promotes expression, I have found, but that can be separated from productivity, capital P. There's an obvious crossover there, but it doesn't have to be part of that world. It can just be the kind of excitement and the quickening of the spirit to want to create and want to express, which I think it definitely lends itself towards.
The quickening of the spirits. I like that. Oh, that's really good.
A lens into my other world.
Yeah. So here's a question. What if Luhmann wasn't around, but this idea, this concept still was where it is today? Let's just do a little thought experiment. Who would people be pointing to as, instead of, canonizing Niklas Luhmann, who would they be putting on the altar and saying, this is the person, or these are the people that we should look to? Look at what they did with their system, with index cards, with their level of being prolific. Is there anyone else to point to?
The first thing you would do is point them to one of your viewers here right now, which is Chris Aldrich, who's in the audience out there, who's really one of the people I know who's sort of clocking that, the kind of history of and the thread throughout from Luhmann and beyond, but Luhmann back as well. So, you're talking about Umberto Eco, is one of the kind of the most well-known, and in part because Umberto Eco is known for himself as well. But yeah, you're looking back for people who took notes in a systematic way and had this appreciation of not necessarily the atomic idea, but the idea, right? That the idea was important in and of itself. Yes, in its connection to other ideas, but that the idea could be kind of taken out and put on a piece of paper or on a card or on some sort of slip, and that idea could then link up to others, right? You're kind of looking for those people. And if you go far enough back, the practice of doing that, certainly in a card catalog system, becomes more, I don't know if it's more prominent than today, because I don't know what the numbers are, but that was the method, right? That was one of the few ways in which people collected ideas, was on slips of paper, boxes, or slips of paper in some sort of container, right?
Yeah.
So you go back far enough, and then you start seeing this practice a little more widely. Today, again, I don't know if it's more widely than today, because we're doing versions of that in so many different ways. Certainly once you get into digital, there's just seemingly infinite ways in which people handle information. But yeah, the only person that I've personally looked to see other ways in which Zettelkasten was handled was Eco, because I knew, and in part because I knew Eco's work. So it's so interesting to me, the history of the Zettelkasten, as much as what's interesting to me is understanding how people I like did things, and he just so happened to have done something somewhat similar.
Yeah. So yeah, let's keep going into that. It was interesting. Someone who I look up to a little bit is Mortimer J. Adler, best known for How to Read a Book.
Yes.
And that is a pretty neat book. There's another one, this Syntopicon, if I'm saying that correctly, and he compiled I think he had his 100 and became 103 great ideas, things like justice, memory, logic,
Mm.
dialectic, these big things.
Mm.
And he said there's a picture of him. It's online somewhere, but it shows him behind all these cards, uh, all the information he collected, because he'd look at all the great thinkers throughout history and look at what their contributions were to these ideas. So did they talk about memory? Did they talk about emotion? I got to tell you, the emotion, the emotion section from a bunch of all male great thinkers over the years was rather lacking. I'll say that. But it,
Mm.
I think the reason I asked you this, and I was just curious for your perspective, because you teach Zettelkasten and it makes a lot of sense. But as far as Zettelkasten, the field that exists out there and the people and the dogma that you're not a part of, but that surrounds it, it's very tiresome to me
Mm.
because it gets in the way. Like, and you can push back on this, but do we really need all this numbering and this and that? And you're not doing it right, and you're not doing it right. And so early on, I'd say the linking your thinking frameworks were kind of like Zettelkasten, except it has this extra layer called maps of content where you can start to like group ideas together. And instead of thinking bottom up, we're thinking middle out. But more and more, I'm thinking, I don't even think that's the best way to bring people in is through Zettelkasten, because of the dogma that you're mostly that you've been able to escape. That's why I like talking with you. But there's so much dogma with it. It's like, you're not doing it right. And it's this mystery. And isn't it just small ideas being linked together?
Yeah, I
Feel
mean,
free to push back on all this.
there's nothing to push back on. You're absolutely right. It's a direct effect of some of the more vocal contemporary people involved in the scene. It's a direct reflect of that. There's nothing about it that's inherent. There's certainly nothing in Luhmann. You don't really find, I mean, I'm working on this piece right now about Luhmann not being a dogmatist. I mean, the guy's talking about his inability to remember things, and, I can't think linearly, so I had to do this. And, I'm actually not such a great writer. I have a hard time structuring long books. And if I did it on my own, I would just rewrite them and never finish them. That's Luhmann, in addition to his many other achievements. He's like sweetly self-deprecating often in his interviews. Certainly the interviews I've been able to get a hold of. He's very humble in a lot of ways. I don't know. Again, I don't know his entire personality. I haven't clocked that, but certainly everything I've picked up is rather humble. And, as with any scene, I mean, I've been part of underground scenes since I was a teenager. Certainly I came out of, like you mentioned, like punk warehouses. Like Zettelkasten has no monopoly on dogmatists and ideologues, attempting to gatekeeper the scene.
Who are the dogmatists in underground punk rock warehouse?
Oh goodness. I mean, who isn't? The thing about subcultures is, and this I have written about, the thing about subcultures is that subcultures are defined spaces because they're in direct response to a so-called mainstream space or a more normative space. So subcultures have this aspect of them, which is they have to demarcate the line, because if they don't, then there's this feeling that you're always going to get pulled back into like normative culture. So that's like subcultures, period. And Zettelkasten is a subculture of a subculture of a subculture. So within it, you have the same BS that you have everywhere else, which is like people attempting to draw lines and make distinctions because their identity of who they are is wrapped up in how they distinguish or separate themselves from other people, from other culture. So oddly enough, you find it even in note-taking. So in some ways, it's like you can just kind of like, it's just sort of, you just ignore it. You can sort of get pulled into it a little bit and wrestle with it. I certainly do, just because I just have a lot of experience doing it. But it's like anything else. The surface is usually kind of beat. And if you get below the surface, you find people who are just doing the work, right? And those are the people I've always been so attracted to, because there's all this like chit chat, a lot of boys talking at the top, and then you just got to get below them. You're talking about the emotional stuff before, you got to get below them and get to where people are just kind of doing the work and having good conversations. And it's there. It's always there. It's there in mainstream culture. It's there in subculture. You just got to look for it. So that's what I try to spend my time doing, is tethering myself to that aspect and not the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thought that was really insightful on the subcultures.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting the need to define, because
Mm.
I definitely, as I'm talking in this space, feel that same need. And I'm like, oh, wow, I guess I'm having a subculture. And I don't know how I feel about that, but it's definitely something to ruminate on. And Bruce had a comment. Wow, this helps a lot. I wonder if that was related to subculture or something else. Bruce will let us know in the chat, but I was curious. But yeah, I think that's something profound to consider.
Yeah. I will say, just for your own sake, I feel like I want to protect you a little bit here, that defining yourself is okay. Like, it's okay that we define ourselves and we kind of set up some parameters. It's just how we handle. You can build a stone wall with barbed wire and electric fencing and guards at the door,
Mm,
or you can have a nice little picket fence.
mm,
They serve similar functions. One sends a certain kind of message and the other sends a different one, but they're both barriers, or some sort of boundary. So yeah, I think, and it's why I like talking to you, and I've certainly said this to you personally and to others, that part of why I think linking your thinking doesn't produce as much of that is, I think, because of the kinds of boundaries you've created that are
mm.
permeable, they're there, but you don't have armed guards at the door, which I think is important.
Yes. Well, it's an ongoing struggle to kind of maintain that
Mm,
sense of
it is.
definition, I guess.
Yeah, it's constant. You have to constantly be aware of it, because you can fall too far one to the other, for sure.
Yeah. Here's one, because I think this is a good differentiator for those note makers in the call. What is the difference between Zettelkasten and light and LYT, linking your thinking? And it probably goes back to that really nice article you wrote about it,
Mm,
which for me, the big reason I wanted to get into light was just to not get into light. Let me take that back. The reason I wanted to put notes together and link them wasn't to create articles or share anything with other people. It was almost like a super advanced journal, a way to ground myself in the chaos of everything happening in the world and with all this knowledge. And it just so happened to have all these great benefits. And I used it for a lot of other reasons. But I think at the core, it was peace of mind for me. And that maybe not necessarily what the Zettelkasten's core thing is about. And that's the thing about linking your thinking, is that's what it is for me, but it doesn't have to be. That's that permeability I think maybe you're referring to. People can use it for outputs, or they can just use it. I always go back to Dungeons and Dragons. They can just use it for their campaigns for Dungeons and Dragons. It's really loose. It's really laissez-faire. It's like whatever, hands off, link notes, make some higher order notes,
mm,
put other notes in those, use that as a tool to make sense of things. And then whatever you do with it, that's up to you. But Zettelkasten isn't like that. I think you want to, you tell me if I'm wrong, but you prefer a narrower definition. So Zettelkasten doesn't become that.
yeah, I mean, I define it more narrowly because I think that in that narrow definition is where its sort of power is. And it comes out of watching people struggle with Zettelkasten and then sort of throwing up their hands and giving up. And I often see that because of the kinds of things people attempt to use Zettelkasten for. So it's not so much that I think it can only be used for writing and thinking. It's that when I see people try to use it for other things, like, keeping track of the friends they want to be in touch with or something like that, they struggle with it. And then they often, at least, I mean, I don't know, I don't follow them. These are people I engage with online, but it seems to be that they kind of drop out or just say like, oh, well, that doesn't work. Zettelkasten doesn't work. It's an old thing. It doesn't work. And that's why in the article, I think I mentioned, I push people towards light kit because I'm like, oh, well, if you want to monitor, be aware of, keep track of more, then there's other systems out there like it that are really catered to that or can really handle that that kind of information better, possibly. But I also don't see it, like, I don't see refining the definition of Zettelkasten as a method for ideating and turning ideation into writing as a limitation. It's like a saw, like, I don't think a saw, like a saw to saw wood, is a lesser tool. It's a tool that does its job perfectly. but I don't think it's lesser than the computer. Like the computer could do so much more, and like it's not like they're not pit against one another. They just serve different functions. A saw has like almost one function only, and a computer has many. But the saw does its function very, very well. So I'm okay with defining Zettelkasten a little more narrowly, or defining its use case a little more narrowly, because I think it does it really well for people who want to do that. Not everybody wants to be a carpenter, right? So not everybody wants to be a Zettler. But I think what it does really, really well. So I define it in this more narrow way, or more narrowly than you might define like kit or linking, I think.
I really like that. And I think it gives it clarity as far as the way that you're defining it, that it's tied to writing and outputs, because it allows you to clearly see the outcome of using it. Like you said, hey, I want to cut down a tree or saw this 2x4. Well, I'm going to grab the saw. And it's funny because a lot of the people that come into the linking or thinking workshop, that's not always the case. They don't necessarily want to saw the 2x4, but many do. That's where it gets tricky, because we have a tool and we've never had this tool before. We really haven't. The ability to think this quickly through links externally. I mean, I know our brains are on a whole different level, but it gets stuck at the speed limit of 4 to 7 items at any given time. So it's just so much we can do. I have a bunch of books, new and old, behind me, and I was using links to figure out connections between these books. How many parts did they have? Usually it's one part, or the 3 parts. How many chapters? Who did they acknowledge in the back? How many pages of the index did they have? How many pages of a bibliography, if at all? Most don't. These are things I didn't know until I started to put them together and link them. And I mean, I guess I could write that down, but it's not dynamic and it's stuck there on the page. I have all my notes about the book next to all this super analysis. I mean, it's just for me to make sense of the literary industry. It's part of a major effort to write a book myself, but all that effort is just for understanding, just for sense making. So I don't know, like, and I feel perfectly fine with that. I feel very, but the productivity people, the hardcore ones, would say, where's the output? You're wasting your time. Everything you do must have an output. And I think, gosh, you're missing, you're climbing the wrong ladder. There's something off with that. How did that become the mindset? So I'll stop my rant, but what do you think about all this?
I mean, you see that it's same with Zettelkasten. Every scene has its limiters. It's just silly, there's no, if you're not, I don't know. I mean, it's like, it's just a complete willful ignorance of how people actually behave and where they find joy. Some people collect notes and never do anything with them, and it brings them great joy. So what? Like, great, good for them. That's great. I'd love to, I've known people who were collectors of ideas, collectors of stamps, collectors of musical instruments. I know a lot of people collect musical instruments, and don't really play so much. Well, they find joy in the collecting. Other people find joy in the ruminating. Other people find joy in the writing, sort of like flexing that kind of like just putting stuff out. For me, I really love output. I love output. I love the feeling it gives me to have something in here and then have it out there. And then it feels like I've given it away. It feels like it is now no longer mine. Like I can now move on. Like it's tethered to all those kinds of feelings. For people who don't have that, they may not need to write. Right, they might use their Zettelkasten or linking or thinking just for kind of ideation and ruminating and just thinking. For me, I feel bogged down if I don't get it out in some way, and it doesn't necessarily matter how many people read it. It's it's just that it's out there. I feel like it's gone someplace. So for me, that's really important. But the idea that is somehow indicative of the way it should be is so silly. I mean, and I've just, any of my friends are so different from one another in their like output and where they find joy, that it would be it would be silly for me to suggest otherwise, and that's just my immediate crew, you know.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
That is very true. And I do like that. That's a prompt I think I'll hold on. A question I will hold on to is, where are you finding the joy? Because yeah, I mean, if we look at just a very generic three, we could look, say, in the collecting, in the sense making, in the outputting. Yes, they are all interrelated and intertwined. But if we had to parse them out just to try to understand, there might be one in particular that is the main area. What is that? Where's that main area where you're finding joy?
Yeah. If
For
someone
me,
wants to help, sorry, go ahead.
oh
Go
yeah.
on.
Well, what is it for you? What is it for you?
I mean, I think of those three steps or those three areas as diagnostic, right? And the same, I do that with Tiago's
Yeah.
code and capture, organize, distill, express, and the three that you just mentioned. To me, they're diagnostic. They're not like steps towards self-perfection. So if someone is at the ideating phase but really wants to output, then I would talk to them about what's getting in the way, where's the pain point, as people call it, what's happening there. But if someone is happy in the other one, then what it just becomes mansplaining if I just jump in and you have to output. You only have to output if you're finding that the rumination phase or area is feeling a certain way that doesn't feel right. And then I might suggest, okay, is there a way that we can offload some of this, like the on-ramp to the off-ramp? And I know for me, just from doing this long enough, that off-ramp is just really important. I was in a band for like 15 years and I played music since I was 10. I know very well that I need to like record stuff and just get it done or get it off my desktop. Because if I don't, I start to feel depressed. I start to feel like kind of gross. I just feel heavy. I feel like nothing's happening. So that's why I have all, when you said my bio, it's part of why I have all these modes of expression. Because I can't just enjoy surfing from afar. I have to do it. Otherwise, it's just surfing in my head, right? So
Yeah.
surf off New York City if I have to, because I have to there has to be some physicality to it for me.
It makes me think of the teacup. There are a couple different stories with it, but yours is always pouring out, so it can always have room for new things to pour in.
Yeah.
As opposed to being full and stagnant, where it can't have anything new come in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I experience it. But other people experience it very differently. They're just like, I have no, I know a lot of people in Zettelkasten and stuff who have no interest in writing. They just don't. But their Zettelkasten is robust, dynamic. It works for them. They love it. They get a lot of joy out of it. They're interesting people to talk to, etc. They just don't have that need, so they don't do it, and that's great.
Yeah. Well, this is so. I've been loving this, Bob. It's time for our Q&A. So we've been essentially, flying around in the clouds, talking about the big ideas, commentary, philosophy, instead of getting into the weeds. I think some of these questions might be a little bit more specific and technical, which is totally fine. So let's start with Lolita here. What is your take on the atomicity of a note? When we start connecting, we inevitably make the note longer, answering the prompts quoted before, for example. That sort of thing.
So atomicity.
Yes.
I really love it. I'm a big fan of it. Going back to Luhmann did not necessarily practice atomicity in his notes, certainly not in the early days. So it's an evolution, part of the evolution of what we're doing. I saw someone mention in the chat there about saws can be used for musical instruments. You're absolutely right. These things can be flexed and used and innovated in new and exciting ways. And that goes for Zettelkasten and the so-called atomic note is part of that evolution. I'm a real strong believer in the atomic note, specifically with regards to writing. Because part of when people talk about, and this comes from Johannes Schmidt, referring to the Zettelkasten as like a writing machine, part of that comes from this ability to connect single ideas in various trains of thought. And the example I use in the class that I teach is the apple, right? An apple is good for your health. Apples are good for your health is a note, right? Or that note could be an apple is good for your health. However, some people believe that too many apples can be bad for your health. Now, in your world, that might be one note. In my world, if I'm being really good about atomicity, I would cut that into two, and I would link them back to show that there's a discrepancy between ideas of apple nutrition. But because they're separate, I can also take the ideas in different directions, right? So a note about apples being good for your health, however, some people believe too many are bad, is really a note about discrepancies within nutrition. But those two notes separately can be about very different things, or can inform or support or refute, or however you're using the note, other trains of thought: agriculture, immigration, diet fads, any number of things. So when you're writing, and when you want to be writing a lot, or at least producing a lot, it's helpful to have notes broken down smaller into their atomic units-ish. I'm more a fan of atomic-ishness, so that you're always pulling. Like I can take one note and take it in one thread one week, and another thread another week. And if it's a really linked note, I can take it another one. That's a month of writing with one note, based off one note, if I wanted to. So yeah, I'm a big fan of atomicity, and for specific reasons related to writing.
Let's hop into that one. So for a counterpoint, I often find that I might be writing about an apple. That's the big thing. And I'll make a bunch of points, and I could make those into their own notes and maybe link back up to the apple or something, kind of use that as a map, and then have the statements. But sometimes I feel, maybe it's just because I don't have enough to say on them, that it fragments my thinking a little. But if I keep it all there, then it's a mushy mess. It's a mushy apple note because it's so long, and then I can't link to specific points because that note becomes too long. But oftentimes the note's not long. I just happen to say a lot of interesting statements. So I don't know. Yeah. I think there's a Goldilocks zone, that a feeling, almost an intuition, that develops for me of when to break something into separate notes, or when to just keep it in the same place, because the opposite might make it too hard to find, or I'll be clicking around too much. Do you have any thoughts on this? I know this one's a little technical, but yes, I do have thoughts. No, it is not. It's too technical. When you're writing that long note, I mean, I would pose this as a question, but maybe we don't have time. But when you're writing that long note, I would say you're in the act of writing at that point. You're thinking about apples. You've got a number of ideas thoughts you have about apples. So you're writing them down. Maybe if there was another step of publishing, that might be an outline developing. And certainly when I outline longer works, I start outlining, but then I ultimately start writing as I'm outlining, because it jogs my ideas. The atomic note isn't really about, the atomic note isn't, for me at least, and what I've seen, it really isn't about thinking. It's about connecting. So when you said before that the note gets a bit too long and it becomes harder to connect, I think that's right. My thinking happens when I'm wrestling with the information, when I take that atomic note and I connect it to others. And now I'm wrestling with, how do these work together? Do I even believe it? Do I sort of believe it, but I'm going to say I believe it more than I do? All sorts of things are happening in my mind. Who do I want to be when I write this? What do I want to convey? And then the writing happens. So by that point, the atomic note is long gone, because I've got all my notes here. So in that writing process, that's where I'm wrestling with it. The atomic note is for when I go back to the Zettelkasten and just say, where can I take this? So I just want to have as many options as possible. Now you could do that in a single note. I don't see any reason why you couldn't. It's just, it then becomes a little hard, like you say, to link that note to other notes. So you've got all your notes on Apple, but how are you getting it out? So for you, it might be very easy. My brain is like, no, let's just break that up and do it that way. But I'm also visually, I see it visually that way too. So yeah, I do think it's interesting, because the tool itself will oftentimes dictate how we work when we want to break something up. Having something as simple as the ability to toggle, to collapse content so we can see more, can radically change a decision whether or not to choose to split apart a big note into a smaller note, or to simply use a toggle, which then still makes that note less descriptive when linking. Because then and then, I think I saw a comment in there, we can always link to headers using specific tools, or, there are all sorts of ways to figure it out, but we're all addressing similar issues, I think. And just the important thing is that I think the key word I always like to hear is wrestling. We're wrestling with the stuff, and how that's where the great stuff really seems to happen, the most enriching aspects.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you think about like the more outliner focused platforms, like Roam or Logseek and stuff, they're kind of like one long note with toggles, and in a lot of way, and people use them to great end. This sort of goes back to just the way we talk about these things and the kind of community we're building. When people ask about atomic notes, we talk about atomic notes and their strengths, but it doesn't mean that it negates other ways, right? This is the problem people can't seem to figure out online, is that you can talk about the many major benefits of atomicity, but it doesn't mean that having long notes, that long notes are somehow not acceptable. Right? Like, it all depends. Like, not all my notes are atomic. That's why I say atomic-ish, because I don't really care. I just know that at some point the note feels like it's small enough, good enough, workable enough. And that's usually around the single idea mark. But do I have notes that have the word but and however in there? Of course I do. Yeah. And should I break them into two notes because of the principle of atomicity? I guess so, but I'm not going to, because I don't need to, because I've got plenty to write about and that note's fine.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
And notes, there are just so many uses. One thing that comes to mind is I'm trying to stop using projects in my thinking space, my world of ideas, and use efforts. And in a single note that is an effort, I might have the way that I wrote about sense making is a form of triangulation as a web post, as a Twitter post, as a YouTube video, as my preferred personal version, all in the entire same note. But then I can see the other variations of it. And so it becomes quite long, but it's all there. And I actually find that quite nice. But these are just variations. It's really fun. Before we run out of all time, that was a really good question, Lolita. Like, we just spent so much time on that topic. It's a good one. So really fast though, where can people learn more about your work?
I have a website, bobdotto.computer. Very simple. And on that website is going to be links out to all the things, or at least the things I'm working on these days. If you put writing.bobdotto.computer, so you put writing in front of that, you'll get to my latest essays and what I've been writing about in 2021. My writing is spread all over the place historically. So there's links to that. If you go to my website, you'll find links to that and videos I've made and books and all this kind of stuff. But those are the two main places. If you start at the website, you'll get somewhere you need to go. But if you want to go right to the writing and some of the more Zettelkasten-y stuff, that's going to be writing.bobdotto.computer.
Okay. Well, we have bobdotto.computer and I have both now, but we have bobdotto.computer. I love your scroll at the top. It's charming. Oh. It is. It's I don't know what it reminds me of, but something.
Yeah. That's the brutalist approach to web design. Chunky.
Yeah. Excellent. And if for those who are interested, you do have a class coming up. I know you don't want to make this about your class, but it's just worth noting. It starts the same day as my workshop.
No.
But
God. I keep doing that.
It's just the way it is. But you're going to find good content at good times with Bob. So if you are interested
in tandem, they're great to take together.
We had someone do that.
Yes, it can be done.
Yeah.
Figure it out. We'll figure out our time.
Exactly. All right. Let's end with one more question and then we'll wrap it all up. So how about this one? Burrell Could I ask what your favorite sift and reflect strategies are for accumulated notes? So it's probably a harder one to answer, but how are you ruminating?
It's usually writing driven because of the schedule I keep for writing. I write all the time. Like I write right when I wake up. My brain is in writing mode, so often write on my phone, like whole essays. Sometimes I just get up and go. So I tend to go from writing into the Zettelkasten as opposed to saying I sit down in my chair with a cup of coffee and a pipe and ruminate, sift through my Zettelkasten. What shall I write today? It's less that and more what do I have in here that can pull from to like support what I'm working on. That said, the way Zettelkasten works, and not to go too long on this because I know we're ending, but Luhmann's practice and the practice I find I engage with and other people, it just comes naturally with Zettelkasten, is that the Zettelkasten is always kind of talking into one of your ears like a little, I don't know if it's an angel or a devil, but it's one of the two. Saying like, hey, you have this or you've thought this. So it doesn't, just because you put a note in there doesn't mean it's forgotten. It's still your first brain is still interacting, right, with the Zettelkasten. So there's always this back and forth, but oftentimes my call to the Zettelkasten comes from an idea I started writing about that I know is touched upon in my Zettelkasten, and I go in there and pull from it and mine it for ideas that I've already taken and are already linked.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that one. I will say this, it's wonderful to have the Q&A being threaded where someone can ask a question and the other 200 people during this live session can actually go in there and start mini conversations, because we just can't possibly get to all the questions here, but through our combined brain power, which is pretty impressive. The people who are here, I've really enjoyed seeing the chats as they've come in, the questions as they've been answered or commented on by each of you. It just creates this full learning experience. Umami, the magical flavor, or is it? Are we talking flavors? Are those?
Well, it's a taste.
Taste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Little taste buds.
One of the senses. So excellent. With that in mind, we're going to be wrapping this one up, and hopefully you did some note making. Hopefully you figured out some differences between Zettelkasten and LYT, linking your thinking, combinational creativity from the hour before with Anne-Laure, and in general, hopefully you've made about note making. How is it similar to something else? How is it different? Why is it important? This is something that is easy to do. A note made a day will keep the doctor away, or something to that effect. And it's always with us. Even if we're not in front of a screen, we can always say the one thing that reminds me of. And then we're off to the races. Okay. So with that in mind, let's all give Bob a virtual round of applause. Woo! Thank you, Bob. This has been great.
Thank you. Has been great. Great questions, and happy to talk about it anytime.